Your Excellencies, let me begin by expressing my profound gratitude to His Excellency President El-Sisi, under whose patronage today's conference and seminar is being held. Let me also add, President, that during your presidency, relationship between India and Egypt have achieved now, beginning to achieve its huge potential. We value the fact that in the last 1 year, President, you spared so much of your valuable time to visit India twice and indeed to be the chief guest on our Republic Day. It augurs well for what lies in rejuvenating the Indo-Egyptian relationship, which has a deep historical legacy. Let me also thank His Excellency Prime Minister Mostaba and the Finance Minister Mohammed Maid, who have joined us today. Dilma, you have delivered an outstanding address as usual, and I must compliment you on your vision, which has consistently guided the MDB's revolution. Minister Rania, thank you so much for this initiative in putting together this distinguished panel to debate on subjects with a focus on the role of the Global South. Indeed, the theme of this discussion today is navigating new horizons. This enjoins us to go back to the drawing board. The drawing board of what? The drawing board of restructuring the global financial architecture, which you mentioned, President Dilma. Restructuring the terms and conditions, the rights and obligations, the governance matrix, and processes and procedures of the multilateral development banks. Embedded in this is a persistent belief that these institutions, which were created in the post-Second World War period, embedded and enlarged under the Washington Consensus, have outlived their utility. They have outlived their utility. And that is why I think that the theme of today's conference on navigating new horizons assumes an added significance. Of course, in doing so, we must be cognizant that it is easier to declare institutions as having been outlived their utility. It is more difficult to substitute them by totally new ones. And that is why I think that restructuring the overall global financial architecture must assume a priority, because the new institutions or the new recalibrated institutions must have international acceptance, must have the financial bandwidth, and must have the ability to attract global capital. From this point of view, during India's presidency, we had the privilege to constitute an independent expert group where, along with my good friend Professor Lawrence Summers of Harvard and myself, are the two co-chairs, we gave two reports. One report, we called it the Triple Agenda, tripling the financing, the mandate, and tripling the windows and the opportunities. We went on to present a second report at the time of the Marrakesh meeting, of the annual meeting. If you will recall, President Dilma and Minister Rania, you were there. This second report, we called it in Marrakesh. This was subsequently adopted, of course, by the G20. It is embedded in the declaration, not only in Marrakesh, but in the New Delhi Declaration. And it said three things. It said, better MDBs. Better in what way? Better by co-creating, for instance, multi-layer country platforms, working on this platform instead of in individual projects, and working together as a family. This is something which, President Dilma, you have emphasized, the MDBs working as a family. Bolder by what? bolder by shifting the focus from risk aversion to informed risk-making decisions, by changing staff incentives, by broadening and innovating risks, sharing instruments to mobilize private capital. And bigger in what way? Bigger to harness the potential of the existing balance sheet of the MDBs, to bring about a transformational change, not only tripling the lending capability, but more importantly, bigger by being able to hopefully secure the continued participation of shareholders, and bigger in terms of their reach and ability to meet the global financial challenges. After the Indian presidency, fortunately, the current Brazilian presidency has brought important new initiatives on some key areas of debt, on recurring inequality, and environment. We hope that under the Troika principle, the Indian, Brazilian, and the South African, which follows, will continue to proceed in deepening the reforms of the multilateral development system. The independent expert groups were supported by important institutions. We have, Minister Rania will be happy to know, we have been tracking the developments almost on a monthly basis. The last report which we did and which we were encouraged because you were having this conference today is only dated the 29th of May. That brings out the main features, what we have achieved, what we have failed to achieve, and the long distance which we have to cover. But here are some disturbing features, which I must be candid to share with you. First disturbing feature, net financial flows to developing countries and the South countries have fallen by 48% in 2022, just $51 billion, the lowest level since the global financial crisis. New projections suggest that the flows will fall by another $100 billion in the next 2 years. Meaning what? Meaning that $50 billion will flow out of developing countries in 2024. According to studies, developing countries paid in 2022 $50 billion more for external creditors than they received. Now, this really, if you ask me, deserves our conscience and our recognition. The external debt, if you look at it, and President Dilma, you have been talking about the issues of external debt. External debt has risen by $40 billion in 2023. The debt service coverage ratio of the sub-Saharan African countries have deteriorated from 21% to 32%. And according to the International Financial Corp assessments, it will go up to $315 billion in 2024. And this is a sad situation because this is for the second consecutive quarterly rise, primarily driven by a surge of debt, which is becoming more and more difficult, to an unprecedented level for emerging developing countries of $105 billion, 55 trillion more than a decade ago. In all this, private capital flows, instead of being honed in, sad to say, the $200 billion of private capital has gone out from the countries of the South. So this is also something which we must consider. About half the IDA-eligible countries have failed to recover, even to post-pandemic income levels. The most consequential finding, therefore, of all this analysis, is that the multilateral development banks are not on track to any of the funding requirements by 2030. They are not on track for quadrupling private capital mobilization. They are not on track on tripling concessional lending and not on track in tripling even non-concessional lending. Having said all this, I'd want to move away that this would present a rather gloomy picture of the world. But while it's all right, there are some positive, optimistic things which are also happening. Like what? Like there is a growing recognition that the multilateral development banks have successfully expanded their mandate, that the financing of global public goods has not come at the cost of sustainable development goals. The World Bank, fortunately, has recognized that there are challenges in which they have evolved. They have mentioned this in the Development Committee report last year in the spring of 2023. They called it the evolution of the World Bank Group. In September 23, they changed the nomenclature, which we will notice is significant. If you remember, historically speaking, the World Bank Development Group had two mandates: the mandate of poverty and the mandate of shared prosperity. For the first time, in presenting in September 23, they changed it to saying ending poverty in a livable planet. This is the first time that the issues of global public goods and the issues relating to climate challenge is being explicitly recognized. And they have gone on now, if you recall, that at the spring meeting, when you were also there, President, Minister Rania, you were present, the World Bank's new document called it the From Vision to Impact, implementing this new evolution roadmap. And these include many positive features: reduction in project preparation time to 17 months from 25. Now, President Dilma, you know that 17 months is still far too long. It's better than 25 months, but not good enough. We must end up in changing the processes and procedures to bring it down to no more than 10 months, from the conception to the disbursement. The World Bank has established, of course, also a guarantee platform in July. They now plan to have a risk-weighted approach, focusing on high-impact projects, reducing risk analysis, duplicating it, tripling annual guarantees to 20 billion for meeting the requirements of the MDBs, and of course, using the facility of the IDB for risk insurance by MIGA and increased engagement with the private sector through the World Bank's Private Sector Investment Lab. Additionally, and you have been an important part of this, President Dilma, the 10 MDBs joining hands to launch a global co-financing platform called the Global Collaborative Co-Financing Platform. This is an important initiative. And the new MDB is an integral part of this under your chairmanship. Going forward, how do I see the scenario? First of all, we, as the independent expert group, owe it to ourselves to continue to monitor progress, to track down the progress. We hope that the BRICS could engage in this monitoring process. We must sustain the reforms of the international financial architecture to fulfill what we committed, better, bolder, but let us not forget bigger. Bigger by all means by harnessing the current balance sheet, in optimizing the current balance sheet, by improving the equity loan ratio, by recalibrating processes and procedures. But one important area we must not lose sight of. That important area, either the shareholders will have to put in far more money for the recapitalization of these banks and for enabling them to be able to fulfill these obligations. Of course, important measures have been taken. The African Development Bank is looking for innovative financing. $750 billion of hybrid capital, which they issued in January, is a pointer. The Asian Development Bank's updated capital adequacy framework report, the World Bank adopting new tools of $157 billion of lending capacity by the adoption of the new tools. And how do we use guarantees far more effectively? guarantees are not being used as effectively because there is a degree of recalcitrance on the part of the current bureaucracy to be able to harness guarantee. It's much easier to lend on your own balance sheet than to be able to attract and get resources by using your guarantees much more creatively and innovatively. And in this process, there are two embedded lessons. First of all, do you know, or do many of us know, the element of duplicity involved by the supervisory authorities? What do I mean by supervisory authorities? I mean the credit rating agencies. Finance Minister, you know the difficult complexities of dealing with credit rating agencies, getting Basel norms aligned with what credit rating agencies would do, and these credit rating agencies adopting duplicity of standards. For instance, to give you just an assessment, they assess not on the basis of actual risk. Sadly, they're assessing it on the basis of geographical risks. This is quite unfair. Risks of OECD countries being viewed in a different way, given the fact that they could be as vulnerable that countries who happen to be geographically placed in some other part of the world. So I think that the morality and uniformity of standards by the supervisory authorities, particularly the credit rating agencies, would be important. Harnessing private capital would remain a very, very important challenge, even as we begin to adopt and harness technology. We recognize the increased power of the Internet of Things, of generative artificial intelligence, of 4Omni, and all its other variations. In fact, these days, curiously, you would be surprised that my co-chairman of this group, Professor Larry Summers, is an important member in the generative open AI of 4Omni and tells me the transformative changes which this is likely to bring about. But we must harness this possibility. We must harness by using the power of AI technology to rejig our processes, to rejig our procedures, to rejig the working of the multilateral development banks, to make them far more efficient than they have been in the past. We must also say that kicking the can down the street for one reason or the other, given domestic and other difficulties, alluding to electoral processes in many important countries, particularly the countries in the West, would really be quite unfair, unconscionable. We must seek ideological and bipartisan support, because if we are to provide orderly transition for daunting requirements of climate financing, which we know, we mentioned, Mr. Rania, about $5 billion to be assessed per annum, and assuming that a lot of it is harnessed in terms of domestic capital mobilization, there is still a long challenge ahead. Let me, before I conclude, make one or two remarks about BRICS. Well, the membership of the BRICS, which you mentioned, was enlarged last year. We greatly welcome that. BRICS is an important member now of the BRICS community, but this enjoins the new possibilities of BRICS. The BRICS economy will now begin to represent 28% of the global economy, 48% of the global population. Under your presidency, the BRICS Bank, which has 9 members, has now got $51 billion of subscribed capital. There are other important initiatives in which the BRICS can participate in the preparation of keeping, for instance, the efforts going as we prepare for Azerbaijan for the COP29, as we prepare for the Summit of the Future of the United Nations, which has been called in September. BRICS can be an important feeder in some of these important initiatives which lie ahead. The BRICS Summit, which is forthcoming. As we speak today, the foreign ministers of the BRICS are meeting. A little later, the BRICS Summit would take place. That's an important opportunity. to do a stock taking of where we stand on all this. So let us end by saying that this 2-day seminar is the best stock taking we can think at this point in time. It has a somber kind of a track record. And this is the right moment for multilateral development banks to respond to these challenges. It's the right time to be able to realize that today's call is seeking the shareholders that you must show global responsibilities, act sensibly, act innovatively, and act in a manner which is conscionable for the future of humanity. In the end, of course, there's an old English adage: you can only take a horse to water. You cannot force it to drink. Speaking in Egypt, you could say the same about camel. I think that the reports have hopefully taken the shareholders of where and what they should do and act in a responsible way. Today's seminar adds to the sensible global voice which seeks conscionable action by countries which have in the past shaped the international financial architecture. Thank you very much for this opportunity.